Hi, I am Coach Sandi Nypaver.
And I'm Coach Sage Canaday.
And welcome to the first episode of the Higher Running Podcast. We did have a podcast before.
We did change the brand name to Higher Running, which is our coaching business, and excited to bring it back because we like to talk about running and training and lifestyle stuff, fitness, through different mediums. Obviously, you have your own YouTube channel. I have my own YouTube channel. We talk about stuff on the Instagram and Strava and all different platforms, Twitter, Facebook. So want to get the audio only version out, but also recording this so you could watch the video as well. But if you want to go out for a run or you're doing a drive, it's nice to listen to just an audio podcast also. So we're dipping our toes back into it. Excited to bring it back.
Yeah, and I'm excited to work with you because, as you said, we both have our own YouTube channels, and so it's very separate. So it's fun to actually collaborate and do something together again.
Yeah, and if you don't know us, we've done any surface, any distance over, I've been running for well over 20 years, mainly track and road, but then getting into ultra marathons, and you've been doing ultra marathons a lot. You've won 100-mile ultra marathons in the mountains. We love the mountains, so yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to structure this podcast in two parts. The main topic today is going to be running economy. But very briefly, we want to talk a little bit about what's going on with us personally. And, a lot's happened the past couple of years, but that could take forever to talk about. So today, I just wanted to start off by asking Sage, what is your health update? Because it's coming up on 2 years ago that you suffered a pulmonary embolism. And yeah, I think people would love to hear how you're doing now.
Yeah, it's honestly, it's been a bit of a struggle. If you've watched, there's a film on the YouTube called Starting Over that our friend Steven Ganoza filmed, and it explains more things in context, but it's been an ongoing thing, and like you said, almost 2 years now. Just really struggling to breathe, especially while I'm running, and it led to some tough races last year. I am training, and I am optimistic that I could get into some more races this year, but there's been a lot of health tests that I've been going through over especially the last several months at specialty clinics in Denver, paying out of pocket with our health insurance. Yeah, 5 figures worth of medical testing, a lot of radiation exposure and stuff like that. So it's been hard. It's not something, the ramifications of the damage from the pulmonary embolism and the implications for how it could affect my longevity is really scary to me. And, besides all the needle pricks and IVs and CT scans, it's been a challenge, especially coming from that background of climbing so well early on in my career in mountain running and doing ultra marathons now, trying to get my lungs back.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely scary from an athletic perspective, but also just a life perspective, because I know running's so important to you, and so not performing how you want because of this, it must be quite a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I've been lucky to have the support of you and the family, extended family, as well as the sponsors still. So still getting out, enjoying the trails and trying to make the most of it. But until these next couple tests go through, I'm jumping through some hoops, it's hard to say what my future holds exactly, and that's nerve-wracking.
We think you have one more big test coming up, and hopefully that's the last one.
Yeah, it's been a lot of tests.
Yeah. I know you don't want to talk about it too much, but before we move on, I just want to say how proud I am of you, of how you've handled these past couple years. You've done such a beautiful job of focusing on what you can do. I think you've really fallen in love with skiing the past couple years, and it's such a great way for you to get outside. And not only that, we spend so much time skiing together, which I feel like in the winter we wouldn't always run together as much. Normally, we go on summer mountain running adventures, but in the summer, typically, or winter, our training's typically different. So it's been so fun to spend time with you in the winter and exploring our local mountains and learning something new. We're not good at it, but I'm really proud of you for how well you've handled it, even though, again, I know it must be such a challenge that you don't always talk about.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you. Couldn't do it without you. And, this is for another podcast, but you've had to face a lot of your own serious setbacks and struggles that put things in perspective. So onward and upward.
Yep, exactly. So with that, you want to get into running economy?
I do. Yeah, let's do it.
I'm just going to start off with a very simple definition, and then we can just kind of riff off of that. So the very, very simplified definition, well, maybe not too overly simplified, but running economy is the amount of oxygen your body uses to cover 1 kilometer. And so if your running economy could use some work, you're going to require more oxygen than somebody who has a great running economy. And we can kind of think of it, the example you always give that I'll use is like a car. So some cars have better miles per gallon, and that's kind of true for people. We're just talking, instead of gas, we're talking about oxygen.
Yeah, I mean, essentially it's an efficiency measure. Part of the equation is actually per kilogram of body weight as well. So it's milliliters O2 consumption per kilogram of body weight per kilometer covered. It could also be per minute of exercise. And it's an economy curve, really, because as you can measure it at different paces. So like in a treadmill setting on a lab test, they might combine it with an actual Vo2max test, which is an all-out maximum oxygen uptake. But while they're doing that, you might be running at slower speeds, easy-paced running speeds. Say it's 8 kilometers per hour or something like that, 6 miles per hour, 10-minute per mile pace. Something that isn't maybe super easy, but it's way under your tempo or threshold, and you have a sustained 5-minute interval at that pace on a treadmill. They have a mask over your nose and mouth, so they're measuring oxygen. And it's submaximal. You might only be at 75% max heart rate. And they say, okay, at this speed on flat ground on a treadmill, this is how much oxygen you use, right? To cover a kilometer. And it could change as they increase the speed. Obviously, it becomes a lot more intense as you approach VO2 max, but the economy, usually you have a bigger cost as it increases too, as the intensity increases. But it could change a lot if you're going uphill on the treadmill, and we'll get into that.
And you're speaking from experience, because I know you were lucky enough to have Olympian Shalea Kip do this test on you and test your running economy at different speeds. And it was pretty fascinating, like your personal results, how your running economy changed at different paces.
Yeah, they found in that study, and part of it was part of a larger study where she had my VO2 max number, 67, in case people were interested. That was in 2017. Working at fractions of VO2 max on a flat treadmill at different speeds, she found I was really efficient at 8-minute per mile pace, which is a good ultra. Yeah. This is on a flat treadmill though, mind you. And then as it increased though up to my marathon pace, 18 kilometers per hour, about 520 per mile pace, 320 per kilometer pace, my efficiency actually didn't deteriorate that much. A lot of times there's a linear relationship with the cost of running, your running economy. The higher the number, the more costly things are. So you actually want a lower number. And actually we could put up on the screen, maybe I have the data there. You could see my economy numbers at different speeds. And it did go up. It was more costly at closer to marathon pace, but the amount was it was a very slow cost. So it made sense because I came from a background of flat road marathon running, and I spent a lot of time training for that. So moving my running form, which is part of the equation of running economy, seemed to be pretty efficient around marathon pace and slightly slower.
That was just kind of what you'd expect, but it was still interesting to see the data.
Yeah, there's some genetic factors involved in that as well as very trainable factors, which we'll get into.
Yeah, we definitely want to get into the applicable things people can do to improve their running economy. But we do have a study we want to talk about. Do you want to jump into that now? Is now a good time?
Yeah. So, the study's been thrown around quite a bit, especially recently. I feel like the published data on it, we could check.
I should probably say the name of the study.
That would be, and we're very grateful. One of the authors of this study, I'll put his name there, sent me a full copy link to it, because If you try to search for it online, it's kind of behind a paywall, which a lot of scientific studies unfortunately are. I mean, I get why they are, but you could only see the abstract to a lot of studies, and of course you need the full picture. So we were lucky to get the full copy of the study. You want to read the title there?
Yes. So the study is Vo2max and velocity at Vo2max play a role in ultra distance trail running performance.
Yeah, and it was actually really interesting because the data they used was from the 2009 UTMB results. Sample size, it was an all male pool of subjects.
Yeah, unfortunately, UTMB probably wasn't the best trail or ultra race to do because it is highly male. But, you know, as these authors said, like more studies need to be done, and hopefully as they do it again, they include 50% women.
It was actually really interesting too because there haven't been very many studies that look at ultramarathon running performance. It was actually very limited because they cite other studies within the study, but if you look at it, it's very limited in terms of design and sample size, and we see why things are hard like that. Because actually, if you look at the sample size, and he was only 22, so there were 34 participants that started the study. They were testing them 4 to 8 weeks before the 2009 UTMB, doing all these lab measurements, treadmill tests, which we'll get into, and then they looked at their finishing time at UTMB. But unfortunately, 35% of the participants dropped out of UTMB, so they didn't finish. So then end sample size is only 22, which, you know, it's a decent data pool. And these guys' average age was 40 years old. Again, 100% male. I think, do we have the average finishing time? I believe it was 35 hours.
Yeah, I believe it was like 35 or 36 hours.
So not a super elite pool, right? Because we have guys like Killian running course record at UTMB, like, you know, sub 19, sub 20 hours. A lot of elites are running closer to 20 hours, whereas this is more of a mid-pack type of selection. I mean, there was a range there, but more or less average age 40 years old. So it wasn't an elite study, so to speak.
Yeah, and I guess before we dive in even more, we both acknowledge that a lot goes into ultra running, and a lot of things can help your race or totally destroy your race. Like nutrition's huge. And, you know, we could use Killian as an example. Like, his fueling has gotten a lot better over the years, and we'll talk about running economy. Like, I think his running economy improved over the years, but I think his fueling also improved over the years, and that's helping him to run faster times now. But then there's also, of course, things like mindset, and if like you can handle the discomfort, or just any mindset strategies you're using to hopefully like help you, or if you don't have them, maybe I'm ranting here, but yeah, mental component's huge. And then there's other things like, are you adapted to the heat, and all that kind of stuff. So we acknowledge a lot goes into a good performance during an ultra race. But with that said, we can go back into running economy.
Well, it's important to acknowledge all these variables, especially in a 100-mile, 106-mile, in the case of UTMB, mountain ultra marathon. Because of the sheer duration, there's a lot of things that could go exponentially wrong. There's a lot of variables at play. You know, you mentioned mental toughness, but also gear management, right? If it's snowing or rainy, maybe, you know, the trail conditions change to mud. That changes things. If you don't have a good rain jacket, or you don't put it on in time, you could get hypothermic and get super cold. And then the next day when you're running through Switzerland, it could be blistering hot and you could get dehydrated. So there's all these interlocking things that come into play. And with science and science, you're always trying to control variables. Like it's about controlling for external variables, trying to isolate the data. But because of the complexity, it's actually it's really hard to do. And that's why studies like this, and all studies pretty much, are going to have limitations. And so they try as best they can, but we have to realize that, and we look at these correlations. Of course, it doesn't imply causation. What happens in the lab, I would say a lot of times actually doesn't translate real well to the real world in mountain ultra trail running. Granted, there's only been limited studies done so far, but the correlations we do have are pretty strong.
Yeah, and I think what you said is right, and the authors did a good job of acknowledging that. Like, they did this on a treadmill. It's very different when you're out on like rocky terrain, and having to maneuver around objects and things like that.
Yeah, so climbing terrain, I mean, that's a big one, and that's what I'll get into with the phrase of variable running economy, which has been disputed a bit online, but a term we did coin, I believe, in years ago in our book, The Sage Running Secret, A Guide to Speedy Ultras, variable running economy. It's not a scientific term, but it's a subjective term that we use to describe these different efficiencies over variable terrain, and it's recognizing that at UTMB, yes, there's 10,000 meters of climbing, 33,000 meters of climbing. There's also 33,000 feet of downhill, right? When you start and end in the same location in Chamonix loop course, equal climbing, equal descent, but steep variable terrain. In the study, one of the limitations they used was they only did treadmill testing, which is a smooth uniform surface versus trail, but it was also locked at 10% incline. And I know why they probably did 10%. Was because if you do the climbing ratio to distance ratio at UTMB, it's actually only 5% about, right? 33,000 feet, about over 106 miles. You do the math on that. However, they wanted to try to hedge that and average that out. So they actually doubled the 5% to make it 10% because they were just looking at the uphill component, right? But as you know from being out on the course, and I've covered the UTMB course, finished it, a lot of the hills are much steeper than 10%, especially when you're power hiking uphill, double pole technique.
Well, even at 10%, I was thinking like, just from competing with other people in races, there's some people who will be much better than me at like 5% grade, but then it hits like 10% grade and I suddenly am moving better than the other person. And so depending on the grade of the hill, like we're just fluctuating places and things like that. So like stuff like that does matter.
Yeah, I mean, simply having the gear requirement on your back at UTMB really matters because, if we go back to the running economy or Vo2max equation, weight is a component of that. Well, the required gear at UTMB, you got to carry, your rain jacket, you got to carry your nutrition, you got to carry a survival kit, you got to carry rain pants, hat, gloves, all these things in a pack. A lot of times that weighs like 4 pounds, give or take. So, 2 kilograms about, I'm not sure if I'm doing that conversion right.
Most people could do
1.5. It's a significant amount of weight on your back, and compared, and you're hauling it for the whole 35 hours or 40 hours or however long it takes you to finish UTMB. Whereas what we're doing in this study is they're essentially running on a treadmill fixed at 10% incline. They are increasing the pace to get a running economy number and a Vo2max value, but are they doing it with trekking poles with a heavy pack? And are we taking into account that it's easy to blast something for 5 or 10 minutes on a treadmill in a lab, then you would pace a hill very differently at 10% grade if you were out there on the course and you're 80K deep in Courmayeur and you're trying to climb up this 20% grade rocky trail.
Is it okay if I read what I think the main finding of the study was?
Yeah.
You can let me know if you agree with me or not. So I'm quoting this directly from the study. And the quote is, velocity at Vo2max showed the highest correlation with performance, even higher than the correlation with Vo2max. This is likely due to the fact that velocity at Vo2max integrates both Vo2max and running economy.
Yes, the velocity at Vo2max I thought was really key versus just a raw Vo2max number, because there's a big difference there. When you're talking about velocity at Vo2max, you are bringing in running economy into the equation. So that's very important. And I think of back to my track and road days of racing, or even reading something like Jack Daniels' distance running formula book, which Jack Daniels, I believe we should credit with coining that term decades ago, velocity at Vo2max and his VDOT tables and all that, is I think of like the 3K time trial on a track, right? 8 to 10 minutes. If you're hitting 100% max heart rate for a couple minutes in there, that speed, that velocity is what we call velocity at Vo2max. And to say that that short distance performance correlates very well to something like UTMB or a long ultra just kind of shows, I mean, that's going to go up through your marathon time and your 10K time. It shows how essential that is, right? And it also, in layman's terms, the way I see the summary of the study is, yes, if you're very talented and you have a high Vo2max, but you're also well trained and you're pretty efficient with your running economy, and you're fit, you generally do better in pretty much any service, any distance. So I can't say I'm surprised.
Yeah, and even the authors of the study give this example of the world record marathon holder, at least at the time in the marathon, he didn't improve VO2 max as he aged and got better at the marathon, but his velocity at VO2 max had improved.
Yes, as you get older, and genetic limitations as well with your max heart rate, your stroke volume, how much you could actually improve that raw VO2 max number, you don't have to improve it, because if your running economy improves, then your performance improves. So even in a faster, flat road marathon time trial situation like the world record holder, VO2 max might even drop during marathon training if you're not doing enough 5K pace speed work. But if you do it still because you want that extra stride power, you want that extra efficiency, that lactate clearance, those all sorts of things going on from biomechanics, but also cardiopulmonary measures, you could be more efficient relative to your 100% heart rate. So you're running at a faster velocity, you're more efficient, there's less oxygen cost, and that translates all the way up to ultramarathon distances. It really is kind of like an extended marathon if we're looking at it just in these scientific terms, just from the data in the study. And the Pearson's correlation coefficient on that with velocity at VO2 max and how it correlated very highly to the ultra distance performance at UTMB, the R value was negative 0.813. So pretty high correlation. And as you said, velocity at VO2 max, taking into account running economy, was the highest predictive value, not raw VO2 max.
Yeah, and it did say VO2 max helps. But again, as you said, the correlation with velocity at VO2 max with performance was definitely higher.
Yeah, I mean, having a high VO2 max always helps. Yeah. Being more talented, that's basically talent. That always helps. It gives you more wiggle room. But if you can't combine that with a high running economy, then it's super. Then that's the best of both worlds, combining good running economy with a high VO2 max. But running economy, especially later in life, let's say you're over 40, it's harder to get big gains in your VO2 max, but you could still get big gains in your running economy with specific strength work, hill repeats, high intensity work. And it's the reason why you would do VO2 max work or speed work, could be like 2-minute hill repeats. It's not because you want to boost VO2 max so much, it's because you want to boost your running economy. And even some strength training, but it has to be specific to the demands of the race. Okay,
so with specific to demands for the race, if somebody has a high running economy running flat, would you say that would not transfer over to running economy for a mountainous ultra?
Usually not, no.
It could, I would say, but not always. If you're not trained for a significant amount of vert or vertical gain and loss, it wouldn't necessarily transfer over.
Yes, a super fast road marathon runner, let's say it's like Kipchoge or a guy that runs under 205, under 210, may or may not do well at UTMB. They have a lot of wiggle room because they're trained very well. They have a high VO2 max probably. They have good running economy on the flat. But if they don't do mountain training, if they don't do hill training, their specific musculature in their legs, building up those motor patterns at the neuromuscular level, but also building up specific leg bulk, so to speak. Like maybe you need a little more quad strength, maybe you need more calf strength, maybe you need better coordination over technical terrain, right? Negative 20% downhill. You're running downhill for like an hour at a time at UTMB with a heavy pack on. Yeah, if they're not trained for that, if they're not used to that, their running economy probably in the mountains is going to be very poor relative to their flat and fast running economy when they're running sub 5-minute mile pace or sub 3-minute per kilometer pace on a flat pavement road in their carbon fiber super shoes.
Yes, exactly. And so for applicable training advice, when I'm training people for a mountainous ultra, yeah, sometimes we do just start off with flat workouts, especially if it's winter and the trails are in terrible conditions, and so it's just easier to do road running. Yeah, we'll start off with building up running economy and really everything else involved with performing well. On flatter terrain, And then as we get closer to the race, we'll really get into like race specific terrain, look at the grades of the climbs of the race and try to mimic that as much as possible in training, both with uphills and downhills, and do specific hill workouts, sometimes doing downhill workouts to prepare for that. And so those are the things I definitely like consider throughout training for a race.
Yeah, and before we jump into that high intensity interval work or these hill repeats or Vo2max training, it's important to develop that aerobic base, consistent, higher mileage, low intensity aerobic training, which in turn already starts improving your running economy and your Vo2max, or at least it theoretically should improve velocity at Vo2max, right? Just having the volume, the efficiency of your aerobic system from low intensity, high volume training sets you up very well to then put the icing on the cake with the high intensity stuff later on, or the more specific vert, the more specific hill training, the musculature that you need for the race distance that you're doing. But it's variable because in the mountains, things change. The slope's constantly undulating. So we could get into variable running economy here, or we could keep, if there's something else you wanted to add.
No, I'm ready for variable running economy, and I'll let you say it since you coined the term.
Yeah, so I think it is a subjective term again, and it's not something that could really be measured in a lab. That's actually kind of impossible, but it's referring more to the range of running economies that you would go through in a race like UTMB. So for example, let's imagine Killian's out there at UTMB doing different sections of the course, but he's doing the full race. The start to Les Houches is pretty fast. First 8K, first 5 miles at UTMB. We're going out sub 6 minute per mile pace, right? So it's fast running, relatively flat on a double track gravel road. If we took snapshots of his running economy running at that pace, 6 minute mile pace, on a flat road, and that would be one value. His heart rate might be a certain value. Now we have a big kicker of a climb up and over to Saint-Gervais, or it could be anywhere on the course. It could be the climb up towards Grand Col Ferret in Switzerland, right? Highest point of UTMB. Now he's going up a 25% grade at times. We'll take a snapshot of his running economy there. Maybe he's power hiking with double pole technique. He's got his pack on. His running economy, his speed is going to be totally different. He's gone from running fast to now power hiking with poles. So we take a snapshot of his running economy there. Now imagine he's bombing down the next downhill. Downhill, coming off the top of Grand Col Ferret, Switzerland, heading towards Champay-Lac. You've got these big downhills. He's running a lot faster again. He's on a single track trail. Maybe it started snowing and it got rainy and it's muddy. Now he's slipping around a little, but he's so good at technical stuff, it doesn't matter. He's efficient there. Now, his heart rate might be the same in all those different snapshots we took. His running economy also might be very similar. Maybe not, but if he's managing it well, if he's managing all these efficiencies over different types of situations, which you all experience at UTMB, then his variable running economy is very good. He has a very good range of motor patterns, of musculature, of cardiovascular fitness that allows him to stay efficient while he's doing totally different things on totally different sections of the course over hours and hours overnight. So his variable running economy is very good, and that's why I say it's the name of the game. It's impossible to measure in a lab. You're not going to get a treadmill going negative 20% with rocks on it. And it does change over time, but it's a good long distance measure, and it's showing that range. So imagine taking infinite snapshots during the race of these different activities and scaling and looking at all these instantaneous values of running economy. That's really the name of the game. And it has implications in terms of muscle strain, shear muscle failure. Because if you're not efficient with your form, it could blow out your quads earlier. If you didn't pace yourself well, you can blow out your quads earlier. If you're more efficient with your running economy, doing all these different activities, then theoretically, you're running at a lower heart rate, and there's less chance that you'll need to take in as much food because you're managing your glycogen stores better, you're burning fat efficiently as a fuel, and hopefully not too much blood is getting diverted from your GI tract. You're just managing it at a more lower intensity, so you're less likely to have GI distress as well. So it all kind of ties together with that.
It also makes it very hard to study.
Yes.
I was thinking of like Courtney DeWalter too. just because she had set the course record at Bandera 100K early January, which is it's not super smooth of a race, but it doesn't have a ton of vertical gain or loss. But then was it less than 2 months later? Around 2 months later, she won Trans Gran Canaria, which is much more of a mountain race. So I just thought that was very impressive. And it's not something a lot of people could do to do that turnover. It was 2 months, but it's still a pretty quick turnover to go from a more runnable trail race to a more mountainous race where, there's a lot of times some power hiking.
Yeah, I mean, she was 10th, I believe 10th at Zagama last year too, and it wasn't even on a muddy year at Zagama. It was a pretty solid dirt course that year. And Zagama's a marathon distance. I mean, it is a mountain race with a lot of climbing, but going against these really fast women who were in the Golden Trail Series and sky running races, just kind of shows her range. And I'd say if she jumped in a road marathon, she'd probably run pretty fast too, even though that's not her cup of tea, obviously. But it just shows, going back to the velocity at Vo2max, going back to running economy, if you're flat out talented and fit, you're probably going to do pretty well on any surface, any distance, as long as you're adequately trained and you're smart with your pacing and nutrition. I'd actually say pacing is probably the most important variable, is adjusting the pace for different sections of the course, adjusting the pace based on your training and your natural limitations that you may or may not know. That's going to determine the outcome of your race probably the most. But again, kind of impossible to isolate and study in a lab study on a treadmill because of all these confounding external variables.
I was also thinking more about technical downhill running. Would you consider that more of just a trained skill and a mindset, something you develop more with practice, allows you to handle it better and be more efficient at running it?
It's a mix of a lot of things. So there's the mental component of fear of falling, for example. And it might be dependent on the race distance and speed, right? If it's the final downhill at UTMB, or you're doing a short mountain race and it's got this technical downhill and you're ready to blast, mentally you might be afraid of falling and hurting yourself or breaking your leg or something. So there's a mental component, a fearlessness component. But then there's also a experience level component where you've practiced on technical downhill, you've gotten more comfortable. It's like with skiing, you get better at steeper downhills and you could go faster. But then I'd also say, there's a certain genetic component where some people are flat out maybe better downhill runners than they are at uphill runners. And some of that could be, genetics with your musculature, but you could also train, doing more squats in the gym, deadlifts, you get stronger legs, you're not as worried about blowing out your quads. You train for downhills at the Boston Marathon, you train for downhills at UTMB, you also can improve that. So it's a nature and nurture mix along with the mental component, and maybe even what type of shoes you wear. Just simply changing shoes will change your running economy.
Yeah, so this actually made me think back to my early days of ultra running when I was still living in Ohio, but I would drive down to Virginia a lot to race. And of course, Virginia has a lot more climbing than Ohio does. But I instantly fell in love with running in Virginia because Ohio, whenever there was hills, they're very punchy, up and down, right? Where Virginia, I could do long sustained climbs, and I just felt like I found my home there. I was just so much better at trying to run uphill for 20 to 30 minutes compared to 2 minutes at a time. And so I think, my nature was that my running economy was just better suited for running up long uphills. And it's not like I ever got to practice it in Ohio. I was just naturally better at it. Yeah, sure, in Ohio I do some hill repeats, but never, and I definitely wasn't running on a treadmill back then. So I was just naturally better at running uphill for sustained periods of time.
And I could, they say Virginia's for lovers, but I could relate to that too. I've always considered myself a much better climber. And, people, when you're racing against a guy like Killian, he's a very, very good climber, but he's world class on downhills, especially technical downhills. So each one of us could find our our niche a bit and kind of capitalize on our strengths and try to address our weaknesses and improve those too. But it is kind of, people face trade-offs.
Do you have anything more to add? I do want to make sure we give people practical advice that they can use into their own training, but I want to make sure you get everything out that you want to say.
Yeah, I mean, the last quote, and we kind of touched on this a bit, this is another direct quote from the study, is they say, however, there is a reason to believe that the lower CR, they're using CR as running economy, so the lower the running economy, which means you're more efficient, again, lower numbers better, for ultra distance trail running performance, since it will be beneficial to have a better efficiency, better running economy for ultra distance running performance, since requiring the lower energy to sustain a given speed would allow runners to sustain greater speeds at the same energy cost, decrease heat production, favoring thermoregulation and preventing dehydration, and use less glycogen stores, therefore requiring less carbohydrate feeding during the race, which in turn could prevent gastrointestinal issues. It is possible that the presumably greater lifetime training volume of better runners may lead to lower running economy, which is better running economy again, and greater lifetime training volume may be a part of the reason why running economy is correlated with performance in our study, despite some people focusing just on that one raw Vo2max number. So that kind of could parlay into practical training advice, real world application of what we've been talking about.
Well, we already kind of like touched on one part, right? Like just increasing your mileage over time. Of course, like whenever you talk about increasing mileage, we talk about doing it intelligently. You don't want to build up too fast. Like if you're going from 30 miles a week and then suddenly trying to do 60 miles a week the next week, like that's not going to work out for you very well. And so whenever we're talking about building up mileage, it's always doing it with a good plan. But I do think, as you were saying before, that can drastically help improve your running economy.
Yeah, I mean, you get specific, especially for ultra running training, you're running at pretty low intensity a lot. You're spending a lot of time on your feet, but you're running at a pace that might be close to race pace in a 100-mile race. And it's easy for a short run, right? So you're building that musculature, especially if you're doing some hills and trails, that is very specific. And that's what really helps your running economy, is we look at it in terms of building up your musculature, your neuromuscular patterns affecting your running form.
Also better, like improve or more mitochondria, more capillary beds, like that all helps.
Yes, the efficiency and there's metabolic costs that can be calculated in there with respiratory exchange ratio, and then also but yeah, capillary beds, better blood flow with mitochondria size and density. And then the icing on the cake, though, is when you start sprinkling in higher intensity, and it could even be lactate threshold tempo run work. Like we prescribe a lot of all uphill tempo runs, like what you said you trained on in Virginia. Maybe if you don't have mountains, you could do it on a treadmill. Maybe it's 10% grade, like in the study here. So you're sprinkling in now more intensity. Well, the intensity is good for the heart rate spikes, the breathing spikes, clearing lactate better. But it's also better for developing specific muscle strength, muscle tension, stimulating fast twitch muscle fibers, especially if you're climbing at faster than tempo intensity. And then the real icing on the cake is when we do these VO2max intensity, or just think like 5K race pace or faster. If you're doing track intervals like kilometer repeats or 800-meter repeats with a short rest, it's not so much that you need to really spike that VO2max up so high. It's more, I mean, that helps. It's more that you're doing speed training to lengthen your stride, increasing your stride rate, your cadence, and getting better hip extension, but just, activating the glutes, getting more power, more spring in each step. That efficiency at velocity at VO2max, a lot of times it'll scale down to much slower paces. You just become more efficient at all slower submaximal paces, like ultra running race pace.
All right, and so I guess I want to bring up another study real quick right here. And this study was on strides, or like 30-second sprints, basically. And so this study titled Effect of Speed Endurance Training and Reduced Training Volume on Running Economy and Single Muscle Fiber Adaptations in Trained Runners. In the study, researchers found that sprint training improved 10K running performance and running economy at 60% of maximal steady state, which, is very helpful for ultra marathons at 60% at maximal steady state. So I thought that was really cool that like something like so short that most runners can do is just like 30-second speed burst. I would argue that even like 15 to 20 seconds would be good. Can improve your running economy at both 10K pace and ultra pace.
Any surface, any distance. And that's why we prescribe things like strides or even alactic hill sprints. That being said, it's a double-edged sword because, like you said, with building higher volume, higher mileage, we see a lot of benefits in all these things. But there is an increased injury risk with the training load. And part of that is being careful when you start sprinkling in high intensity. A lot of times there's more impact force. And so you do have to be mindful of how you do it. And that's why we integrate things in our higher running training plans. We sprinkle it in. And it's not like you're adding in a huge amount of Vo2max training or any training that's way over the threshold. And how you manipulate the rest interval in these high intensity intervals is very specific to managing lactate levels, keeping the blood pH in check, but then also not getting sloppy with your form or causing an injury. Muscle strain, you could tear a hamstring or calf pretty easily. You're sprinting up a hill if you're not prepared for it.
So you brought up two really good points. And just to touch on the first one real quick, the recovery for these strides or sprint type things should be quite long. So if you're doing 30 seconds, I would normally give at least like a 90-second walk jog in between. The second thing is something I do with some of my athletes who aren't used to strides or hill sprints. I'll just say do pickups first. And I define pickups differently than strides. So pickups would just be like 6 times 30 seconds. And I just tell somebody to like just pick up the pace a little bit, like faster than what you've been running, like not as fast as strides. Strides get close to like top speed, but maybe not quite there. So pickups are definitely like a step below that. Let your body get used to running a little bit faster. And if that goes well, like no pain, no issues with that, then we'll step it up and be like, okay, you can do actual strides now where you build up speed in like between like 15 to 30 seconds.
Yeah, and it could be as simple as just going to the track and starting off with 150 meters with an acceleration and be like, I'm going faster than 5K pace. I'm probably hitting faster than velocity at Vo2max, but you're stimulating fast twitch muscle fibers. You're opening up the stride with a wider length, better hip extension, better power, probably a higher turnover. Cadence could also be way over 180 steps per minute, probably 190, 200 steps a minute easy. And yeah, you might not race an ultra at 200 steps a minute. You might be 160 steps a minute with your cadence on a trail, especially going uphill, but you've become more comfortable. That ease of movement, the neuromuscular patterns have developed because now you have this bigger range of speed training. So running economy, it scales. You get more efficient at moving basically at this wide range of paces. So it has a lot of implications for all distance running events.
Right. Yeah. And if you're going to do strides at a track, you could always start off doing it on the grass and then progress to actually doing it on the track itself.
Yeah. So yeah, speed work's definitely not to be ignored, but aerobic base as well.
Yeah. And then I think that one of the, there's multiple things that go with running economy, but I think the last major thing would be strength training. But it's very specific strength training. It's high or heavy weight, low reps. So yeah, pretty powerful strength training, but there's been multiple studies that showed like that's the most effective way to use strength training to improve running economy. However, the issue with this is that if you're doing heavy weights, high reps, like your form has to be really good. Otherwise, it's just a huge injury risk or you're just integrating poor motor patterns that can carry over to your running. And so I love heavy strength training. When people start it, even if you start strength training, I suggest just working on form before actually going heavy, or working with a strength coach or some physical therapists. They're really good at stuff like this. They can help you out too, just to make sure you're setting yourself up for success here.
Yeah, and if it's taking too much time from building your aerobic base, it could hurt you as well. And if you're bulking up in the wrong areas, it could actually hurt your running economy. Usually we advocate strength training because it's great for also injury prevention. So like Sandi said, consult an expert, see your strength coach, PT, get a movement assessment done, because if they find, oh, you maybe have weak quads, then you could work on your squats and doing these body weight exercises. But hill training, hill reps, high intensity hill reps is also like speed training in disguise. And, you know, even if you go back to like Arthur Lydiard, hill bounding, it's a lot like doing a lot of gym exercises with deadlifts and squats. Glute activation exercises are generally pretty safe, especially with resistance bands, but it really is kind of the icing on the cake of developing specific musculature that's going to help improve your running economy and injury resistance. But that stimulation of fast twitch muscle fibers is key, especially for a long distance runner, when if you might just be doing all LSD, long slow distance, you don't get that stimulus without doing some speed training and weight training.
Yeah, and I'll quickly touch on this study. In 2008, Storn, I'm not sure if I said that last name right, and other people on his team reported that maximal strength training improved time to exhaustion at maximal aerobic speed and running economy at 70% of Vo2max. So interestingly enough, is kind of similar to the other study I had said. But as you were saying, I do think if you want to be safe, you know, strides and hill sprints are very smart for most runners to do if you're a little bit worried about actual strength training.
Yeah, and you're bridging the gap with high-end aerobic stuff with tempo lactate threshold training, even if it's like 3 times 10 minutes all uphill, or you're doing 5-minute intervals uphill, 5 minutes downhill. Got to be careful in the downhill reps. You're building the heart and lung efficiency, but you're also building the musculature and the resistance to sheer muscle failure, which causes cramps for a lot of people in marathons, but also ultra marathons. So it's very complex, but at the same time, it's also like, have a mix in your training. Build up your aerobic base first before you add too much intensity. Don't add too much intensity.
Well, adding to the complexity, there was another study, I don't have it written down, but I was reading about symmetry for running. Like if one leg is stronger than the other, that's going to throw off your symmetry, but when you're more symmetrical, you have better running economy. And so that kind of is making me think, well, so does that mean like your typical like core work strength training, so more like bands, body weights, light weights, would that improve your running economy if somebody has asymmetric like imbalances on one side compared to the other, and just fixing those imbalances, that would improve your running economy. So then maybe you could say your typical core work could improve running economy. This is just me like going through thoughts and speaking them as I go. But I do think that was really interesting to point out that being symmetrical matters.
Yeah, especially for not getting injured. A lot of injuries stem from asymmetry, and no one's perfectly symmetrical. So yeah, muscle imbalances could definitely do a number on your running economy, and that's why we address it with correcting it through specific motor patterns, drills, strength work. But your body also kind of is good at naturally ironing out things, as long as you're being smart about your training and not running with sloppy form. 'Cause Jack Daniels, going back to his original talk about increasing cadence closer to 180 steps per minute at pretty much all paces on flat ground, they found that a lot of people, their running economy improves just from a slight form change, a slight increase in cadence or stride rate, and that's something you could think about on a daily run. But if you overdo it, your running economy could go down the toilet and start getting worse. So it's a double-edged thing.
Yeah, we'll wrap this up soon, but I was thinking with like form adjustments that your running economy would probably suffer until you fully adapt to the form changes.
There's a certain neuromuscular fatigue with trying to make a change, and you want to make slight changes in your running form, if any, usually. But yeah, there's a certain neuromuscular fatigue, or neuromuscular pathways need to develop into a habit more, and that's a process of weeks and weeks or months and months even. And it's something you have to really concentrate on at the brain-body connection.
Yeah, so the example I just came up with, because I know examples help me out a little bit, like if you're a very quad dominant runner and you want to switch to, using your glutes a little bit more, your musculature has to change in order to support that form change and make it easier. So yeah, that's just the example I thought of.
Yeah, well, I think covered a lot in this talk. Again, back to the variable running economy and the science, looking at the science and studies, realizing their limitations, but also grateful for that insight, and just, being able to analyze all those variables is real key in developing training plans, coaching athletes, and getting people to hopefully reach their full potential in their chosen goal race or event.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. If there's other topics you want us to cover, please let us know. You can find us at higherrunning.com, coaching, training plans, all that great stuff.
Free newsletter. You can sign up at higherrunning.com.
Oh yeah, we have a lot of free training plans.
Business plug, yeah, and that's our handle on social media, Higher Running, but also we have our own personal accounts and YouTube channel, so check us out, Sandi Nypaver, Instagram.
YouTube is Running Wild Sandi, or just type in Sandi Nypaver on YouTube and you'll find me.
Type in my name, Sage Canaday. I am on Twitter a lot, Instagram, TikTok, you name it. Vo2max Productions on YouTube, personal accounts. So thanks for tuning in. We really appreciate all your support and for following along on this first episode of the Higher Running Podcast.